Namaste students. Today we are going to learn about Chapter 7 Weavers, Iron Smelters and Factory Owners in History. The industrialization of Britain had a close connection with the conquest and colonization of India. In the late 18th century, the company was buying goods from India and exporting them to England and Europe, making profit through the sale. With the growth of industrial production, British industrialists began to see India as a vast market for their industrial products, and very soon manufactured goods from Britain began flooding India. This badly affected Indian crafts and industries. Let's see how was the Indian textiles and the world market. Around 1750, India was the world's largest producer of cotton textiles. This was the period before the British conquest of Bengal happened. Indian textiles had been famous for fine quality and exquisite craftsmanship. Indian textiles were extensively traded in Southeast Asia and West and Central Asia. From the 16th century, European trading companies began to buy Indian textiles for sale in Europe. Many words in English and other languages in current usage show the proof of this flourishing trade. The word muslin was used to refer to all finely woven textiles. This word is originated from Mosul, which is in present day Iraq. This was the place where European traders first became aware about fine cotton cloth from India. The Arab merchants used to bring fine cotton cloths in Mosul. The word calico was used as a generic name for all cotton textiles. The Portuguese first landed in Calicut, that means Kerala. The cotton textiles which they took back to Europe came to be called calico. The word chintz is used for cloth with small and colorful flowery designs. It is derived from the Hindi word chint. The word bandana refers to any brightly colored and printed scarf. This has come from the Hindi word bandana, which means tying. This term in Hindi was used to refer to brightly colored cloths produced through the method of tying and dyeing. Similarly, many other words were used which show the popularity of Indian textiles in different parts of the world. Indian textiles in European markets. By the early 18th century, the wool and silk makers in England were worried by the popularity of Indian textiles. They began to protest against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government banned the use of chintz in England. This act was known as the Calico Act. Once the government protection began, the calico printing industry was the first to grow. In this industry, Indian designs were imitated and printed on white muslin or plain unbleached Indian cloth. Competition with Indian textiles also forced various technical innovations in England. The spinning jenny was invented by John Kay in 1764. This machine increased the productivity of traditional spindles. Steam engine was invented by Richard Arkwright in 1786. This revolutionized cotton textile weaving. With the help of these two inventions, cloth could be woven in huge quantities and at cheaper rates. But till the end of the 18th century, Indian textiles continued to dominate the world market. European traders made enormous profits from this flourishing trade. In the early 19th century, textile production was concentrated in 4 regions in India. Bengal was among the most important centers. Presence of numerous rivers and delta made it ideal for transporting goods to distant places. It is important to remember that railway and roadway were not developed at that time. Dhaka, modern Bangladesh, was the most important textile center in the 18th century. It was famous for mulmul and jamdani weaving. A cluster of cotton weaving center was along the Coromandel coast, which stretched from Madras to northern Andhra Pradesh. The important weaving centers along the western coast were in Gujarat. Who were the weavers? Weavers usually belonged to communities which specialized in weaving. The skills for weaving were passed on through generations. The Tanti of Bengal, the Julahas and Momins of North India, and the Sale, Kaikollar and Devangs of South India are examples of some weaving communities. Spinning was mostly done by women. The charka and takli were traditional spinning instruments. The thread was spun on the charka and rolled on the takli. Weaving was usually done by men. Dyeing was done by dyer who also came from a particular community. Printing was done by specialist block printers known as chipikers. Handloom weaving and associated occupations provided livelihood to a large number of Indians. Let's see the decline of Indian textiles. The development of cotton industries in Britain affected the textile producers in India in various ways. British textiles were now giving competition of Indian textiles in the European and American markets. High import duties in England made it difficult to export textiles from India. Thus, the British manufacturers cotton textiles ousted the Indian textiles from their traditional markets in Africa, America, and Europe by the beginning of the 19th century. In India, thousands of weavers became unemployed. The weavers in Bengal were the worst hit. Rural women who used to earn livelihood by spinning cotton became jobless. However, handloom weaving did not completely stop in India. Some types of cloths could not be made by machines. Intricate design and embroidery could not be done by machines. Such designs had good demand in European market. Moreover, the British manufacturers did not produce coarse cloths. The coarse cloths were popular among the poor in India. Many weavers became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities to find work. Some others migrated to work in plantations in Africa and South America. Some of the weavers also found jobs in the new cotton mills which came up in Bombay, Ahmedabad, Sholapur, Nagpur, and Kanpur. The first cotton mill was set up in Bombay in 1854. From the early 18th century, Bombay had developed as an important port for the export of raw cotton. The vast cotton growing region was in close proximity to Bombay, and supply of raw material was easy for the new cotton textiles mills. By 1900, over 84 mills were operational in Bombay. Many of these mills were established by Parsi and Gujarati businessmen who had made money through trade with China. Cotton textiles mills came up in other cities too. Example, Ahmedabad and Kanpur. Growth of cotton mills created new employment opportunities. Thousands of poor peasants, artisans, and agricultural laborers migrated to the cities to work in the mills. The textiles industry of India faced many problems in the first few decades of its existence. Competing with cheap textiles imported from Britain was difficult. The governments of most of the European countries protected their local industries by heavy import duties. The colonial government in India did not provide such protection to local industries. It was during the First World War that there was the first major boost to the development of cotton textile industries in India. During the war, textiles imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. Wood steel. The sword of Tipu Sultan has been the topic of many tales. The sword was special because it was very hard and had very sharp edge. This quality came from a special type of carbon steel called wood steel. The wood steel was produced all over South India. The sword, which was made of wood steel, used to have very sharp edge with a flowing pattern. This pattern was the result of very small carbon crystals embedded in the iron. Francis had toured through Mysore in 1800 and had given a rich account of technique of wood steel manufacturing. This steel was manufactured in small furnaces. Iron was mixed with charcoal and put inside small clay pots. Steel ingots were produced through intricate control of temperatures. Those ingots were used for sword making in India as well as in West and Central Asia. The wood steel making process was completely lost by the mid 19th century. This happened because of the steel import from Britain, but iron smelting was quite common till the end of the 19th century. Especially in Bihar and central India, every district had smelters that used to produce iron for a variety of uses. The furnaces were usually built of clay and sun dried bricks. Smelting was done by men, while women worked the bellows. But by the late 19th century, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In New forest laws were also responsible for this because finding wood and charcoal was becoming more difficult. New forest laws also restricted the smelters' access to iron ore mines. Access was granted by the government in some forests, but the smelters had to pay very high tax for every furnace they used. By the late 19th century, imports from Britain affected the smelters. By the early 20th century, iron and steel factories began to come up in India, and this proved to be the final blow for the small scale smelters. How were iron and steel factories come up in India? Jamsetji Tata was planning to establish a steel plant in India. His son Dorabji Tata initially searched for potential location in Chhattisgarh. The Tatas could find iron and ore deposits in Chhattisgarh, but they could not find a good source of water. Water was important for running an iron and steel factory, and hence they decided to look somewhere else. Finally, the Tatas could find a large area of iron ore reserve on the banks of the river Sabarnarekha. The Tata Iron and Steel Company was set up at that place and production in the factory began in 1912. This place was developed into a township which is now known as Jamshedpur. This was an opportune time for TISCO because expansion of railways in India was taking place. Initially, the British experts in the Indian railways were not convinced about the quality of steel produced in India, but the First World War changed the situation. Steel produced in Britain was being utilized to meet the demands of the war. As a result, the Indian Railways turned to TISCO for supply of rails. The TISCO also produced shells and carriage wheels for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of steel manufactured by TISCO. Gradually, TISCO became the biggest steel industries within the British Empire. Let's look the recapitulation of this chapter. Indian textiles were famous in western market under different names such as muslin, calico, etc. From the 1680s, there started a craze for printed Indian cotton textiles in England and Europe, mainly for their exquisite floral designs, fine texture, and relative cheapness. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles chintz in England. This act was known as the Calico Act. Competition with Indian textiles led to a search for technological innovation in England. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kaye, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. By the 1830s, British cotton cloth flooded Indian markets. By the 1880s, two-thirds of all the cotton cloths worn by Indians were made of cloth produced in Britain. Thousands of rural women who made a living by spinning cotton thread were rendered jobless. Handloom weaving continued to exist to some extent because some types of cloths could not be supplied by machines. Machines failed to produce saris with intricate borders or cloths with traditional woven patterns. Many weavers and spinners who lost their livelihood now became agricultural laborers. Some migrated to cities in search of work, and yet others went out of the country to work in plantation in Africa and South America. The first cotton mill in India was set up as a spinning mill in Bombay in 1854. Afterwards, mills came up in other cities too, like Ahmedabad and Kanpur. The textile factory industry faced various problems in the beginning. The first major spurt in the development of cotton factory in India was during the First World War, when textile imports from Britain declined and Indian factories were called upon to produce cloth for military supplies. Indian wood steel, which was produced all over South India, fascinated European scientists. Several iron smelters lost their job. The demand for iron produced by them inevitably lowered. By the early 20th century, the artisans producing iron and steel faced a new competition with the coming of iron and steel factories in India. Tata Iron and Steel Company began producing steel in 1912. Soon in 1914, First World War was broke out. Steel produced in Britain had to meet the demand of war in Europe. Import of British steel into India declined, and the Indian Railway, that was expanded at the time, turned to Tisco for supply of rails. The war dragged on for several years, and Tisco had to produce shells and carriage wheel for the war. By 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by Tisco. Over time, Tisco became the biggest industry within the British Empire. As the nationalist movement developed and the industrial class became stronger, the demand of government protection became louder. Thank you.